Continuing in Washington right now, in the studio right next to ours by Phyllis Bennis, the fellow at Institute for Policy Studies, specializing in Middle East and United Nations issues. Her books include Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power, as well as Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. Phyllis, to start, as you listen to Amer's story, where does international law fit in, not to mention local law in Israel and the occupied territories?
Yeah, it's very difficult, of course, Amy, to listen, to hear firsthand the horrific character of these attacks. But it is very important that we understand the legal basis and the question of the role of the United States. The United States, of course, has provided an average of $3 billion a year in military aid to Israel. The F-16s, the Apache helicopters, the TOW missiles, a huge amount, the fuel, the fossil fuels that are fueling the Israeli military right now, all are coming from the United States. And that makes us complicit in a very direct way when those weapons are used illegally. And according to U.S. law, the Arms Export Control Act, it is prohibited for Israel or for any country receiving U.S. military equipment, but in this case Israel, it's prohibited to use that equipment, that military equipment, that ammunition, those weapons, outside of very narrow constraints. All of this violates those narrow constraints. Beyond that, the question of international law is impacted very directly. The Israelis have a very particular obligation in Gaza and the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem as the occupying power. Under the Geneva Conventions, as the occupying power, Israel has the obligation to protect the civilian population. And that has a whole range of specific obligations, starting with no collective punishment, no use of prohibited weapons, the whole range of attacks that we have seen during this period of the 3-week war in Gaza constituted a whole host of violations of different articles of the Geneva Convention, starting with Article 33, that prohibits as an absolute any collective punishment, meaning that the siege of Gaza, which was creating a humanitarian disaster in Gaza even before the military assault began, was itself a violation of the prohibition that says Israel cannot punish anyone in Gaza, let alone the entire population of 1.5 million people, half of whom are children under 17, cannot punish them for any act they were not personally responsible for. So the notion that they could fire on a civilian car, in this case with a father and his 2 sons, knowing they were civilians, who were guilty of nothing, who were accused of nothing, that they could fire on that car because they felt threatened or for any other reason is absolutely a violation. Then there's another violation inherent in the refusal of allowing medical care, refusing to protect the wounded. So the fact that there were medics on the scene who asked, maybe begged, the Israeli commander to treat the wounded as they are obligated to do under international law. Those medics were trying to do what international law says they must do, and they were prevented from doing so by their commander. That makes their commander guilty of another separate war crime, a crime of the violation of international humanitarian law that requires them to provide aid and medical help to the wounded. So there's a host of violations here, the kind of weapons that we're seeing being used, the use of white phosphorus, for instance, which was used not only in civilian areas, which is all of the Gaza Strip, is one giant civilian area. There is nowhere to hide. That's been the conclusion of Amnesty International, that when Israeli notifications to people in Gaza said, you should flee because we are going to bomb your home, we are going to attack your neighborhood, there is a Hamas person who lives next door. There is nowhere in Gaza to flee.
Phyllis,
in this most densely populated
Phyllis,
area.
in this particular case, the issue of who would actually follow up this case, because there are witnesses, clearly, and they did not even take into custody the father, so they didn't, they weren't possibly claiming he did anything illegal. Who would pursue this case?
Well, I assume that because of the level of of publicity on this case. The fact that the father's pleas were broadcast while they were going on Al Jazeera, perhaps other networks as well. In these kinds of cases, historically, the Israeli military, the IDF, has claimed over and over again, we are investigating. Besides that, I would assume that the humanitarian organizations on the ground, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, the Palestinian organizations like Al-Haq, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights in Gaza, the United Nations Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I'm sure will take an interest in this.
Phyllis Bennis, I want to thank you very much for being with us, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Her latest book, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. And that does it for our broadcast. We thank you all for joining us. To see the images, read the transcripts, you can watch and listen to the show at democracynow.org. On Saturday at 2 o'clock, I'll be at Essex Junction High School in the auditorium, part of a program for Vermonters reading. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berkshire, Huda Cadusa, Armate, Angelique Comet, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.